Welcome. This is an event of the Project for an Informed Electorate, which is a new entity here on campus. Please go to our website. It's listed here. We have all kinds of voter information, misinformation, fact checks, all kinds of good content for voters, including more details on the initiatives, which hopefully you won't need because you'll get everything you need today. So today we're talking about the initiatives. We'll go through all 11. The plan is to, we'll describe each one. We have about 5 minutes for each one because we want to keep it under an hour. We can do questions right afterwards if you have some kind of clarification question, but we can't go too long on each one. But if there's something confusing, feel free to ask. We will present you with the endorsements as well. A lot of times that's a really helpful shortcut for voters to sort of see who's endorsing what, and also who spent money on each side of the campaign. So we'll present that here too. If you can't see the charts and graphs, then let me know. I can send you a copy of this content later. And also we have a little score sheet out front on the table if you didn't grab one on the way-ins, if you want to sort of follow along and pick your winners so that you can take that into the voting booth with you. We have those available outside. So our panelists today, we have Steve Boilard. He's the director of the Center for California Studies here on campus, and previously worked at the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is the nonpartisan organization that works with the legislature doing policy analysis. He's also been an assistant professor at Western Kentucky University and an instructor at UC Santa Barbara and a policy analyst with the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Also with us today, Stacy Gordon Fisher. Stacy is a professor at the University of Nevada at Reno, so even though she teaches in Nevada, we will still welcome her here because she focuses on California in a lot of her research. She is a visiting scholar at the Center for California Studies here on campus as well, and she writes about congressional behavior and political behavior and has a book called Campaign Contributions and Legislative Voting, A New Approach. And I'm Kim Nalder. I'm the director of the Project for an Informed Electorate and an associate professor in the government department here. I do work on misinformation, public opinion, and media effects. So with that, we will start with, we'll go through the initiatives and sort of trade off who does what. We'll start with Steve Boilard, who will do the big ones, some of the big ones that are the tax measures, starting with Prop 30.
No.
No? Is this one on? Yeah. Okay.
All right, how about now?
Much better.
A little better. So the two measures that I'm going to start off with are Prop 30 and 38, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. There's been a tremendous amount of media buys on them. And these are the two pretty large tax measures that are on the ballot. And I'm trying to think how best to organize this because we want to do them both kind of side by side. So with your permission, I'll kind of jump back and forth between 30 and 38. At base, Prop 30 is two tax increases. It's an increase in the personal income tax. The personal income tax is one of the big three taxes that the state collects for its revenues. Personal income tax, sales tax, is corporate taxes as well. But the income tax would go up for high income earners, those making $250,000 or more, $500,000 more filing jointly. And if you think about the tax structure, as you probably know, we have a progressive tax structure, meaning that as you make more money, you're charged a larger percentage of your income in terms of your income tax. So if you make a very small amount of money, you're not really paying income tax. If you're making kind of a little bit more, you're making a few $1,000s, you're paying a few percentage points of your income tax. This goes up to the highest bracket, which is 9.3%. Currently, the most you would pay in state income tax is 9.3%. What this Prop 30 would do is it would raise above 9.3% by an additional percentage point for those just kind of over the line, making 250,000 or more, all the way up to 3 percentage points more. In other words, it would get up to 12.3% for the highest income earners. This is a temporary tax increase and be in place for 7 years. In addition to that, well, actually, now let's jump over to Prop 38. Prop 38 has a personal income tax increase as well. That's really quite different, because with Prop 38, it's increasing almost every bracket. So no matter how much you're making, you're going to pay a little bit more in the form of income taxes. In other words, all the brackets are protected except for the top ones under Prop 30. Almost all the brackets are increased under Prop 38. Prop 38 is, I guess you'd call it a temporary income tax increase, but it goes for 12 years. So you know, at what point do you not call it temporary and start calling it permanent? But it's a 12-year increase. So that's the difference in the personal income tax components. In addition, Prop 30, the first one we mentioned, also has a sales tax increase of 0.25%. So every time you buy something, you're buying goods, you're currently paying somewhere around 8% in sales tax. It'd go up an extra 0.25%. So if you're currently paying 8%, you pay 8.25%. Those two combined, the income tax increase under Prop 30 and the sales tax increase, would generate about $6 billion per year in additional revenue for the state. And to give you a sense of magnitude, the state general fund these days has somewhere around $93 billion in revenue annually. Prop 38 does not have, just as the income tax, not the property tax increase, it would raise about $10 billion per year. So again, Prop 38 is going to raise much more money because it's hitting a lot more people with those income tax increases. The other thing to say about this, and this is one of the more controversial parts, but I think it's really worth pointing out, is the budget crisis that the state has been experiencing the last X number of years, last 10 years or so, is due in large part to revenue volatility, meaning it's really hard to predict how much money the state's going to bring in any given year. We try and pass a budget every year, an annual budget, and that budget is notoriously wrong on predicting how much money comes in. Sometimes it's much higher, sometimes it's much lower. And generally, the office I used to work for, the Legislative Analyst Office, has really said that to a large extent, this is because we're placing such a large portion of our revenue coming from very top income earners. And I think that's one big difference between Prop 30 and 38. Prop 30 puts kind of more of the focus on the top income earners. 38 spreads it across a little bit more. Okay, one other really big difference between these two, and this is, again, I think a point that shows up in a lot of the campaign ads and controversy, and that is what happens with this money. You're raising $6 billion under Prop 30 or $10 billion under Prop 38. What's going to happen with that dough? Under Prop 30, that money would be seen as general fund revenue, which is technically unrestricted revenue. However, the state constitution contains a funding formula that requires that a certain amount of money go to K-12 schools and community colleges. So the so-called Proposition 98 guarantee. There's a formula that determines how much of the money that comes into the state needs to go to those schools. And what that really means is if more revenue comes into the state, more money has to go to K-14 education. So if you bring in more general fund revenue, a portion of that will always go to K-14 education. So under Prop 30, more money goes to schools, not because the revenue is put in a special account saying this just needs to go to schools. It's just because the more money the state brings in, the more it has to give to schools, if you see the distinction. The reason I'm emphasizing that is because Prop 38 actually takes all this money, the $10 billion, and puts it in a separate account. It's not subject to that Proposition 98 guarantee. It's not it doesn't feed into that formula determining what portion goes to schools. Instead, Prop 38 creates a whole new mechanism with a whole new allocation formula, saying of this $10 billion, here's how it's going to be spent. 70% of it, $7 billion, is going to go to schools, K-12. About 10% of it is going to go to early childhood education, and 30% of it is going to go to retiring the state's debt. The state has a number of bond issues put out. We owe money on these bonds, and Prop 38 would take 30% of the new revenue and put it towards those paying off state's debts. Finally, my last big point on these two is with Prop 30. This is the one that the governor has promoted. This is the one that's linked to our state budget that was passed this year. As you know, we have a state budget in place. We're currently in the 2012-13 fiscal year. That budget assumes the governor's that the governor's tax increase will pass. It assumes that Prop 30 will pass. If Prop 30 does not pass, then $6 billion of trigger cuts will occur, meaning most of that would mean that K-12 schools would lose about $5.4 billion that's currently, they're supposed to be getting on this budget. That would disappear. The universities, UC and CSU, would each lose $250 million. So again, it's not that so much that Prop 30 would provide new funding to the universities. It's just that if Prop 30 doesn't pass, there's a hole in the current budget, and that means the universities would receive these reductions. Prop 38 has no direct impact upon our existing state budget. And what that actually means is if Prop 38 passes and Prop 30 fails, the trigger cuts still occur. The cuts still happen to K-12 schools and the universities. Now, you have to ask yourself, the cuts go into effect, but there's this new revenue showing up, from this new type that has to get spent somewhere. You can hope the money will be used to restore these cuts, but there's no guarantee of that. As a matter of fact, I think it'd be highly unlikely because this money's already accounted for under that existing formula going to K-12 schools, early childhood education, and retiring the debt. Anyway, I think if that's not confusing enough, I can certainly make it more confusing with any questions. But essentially, again, these are competing tax measures that would generate many billions of dollars, but they're very different both in who gets taxed, what happens to the revenue once it comes in, and the effects upon the existing state budget. And with that, I take any questions. Yeah.
One real quick one. I assume on Prop 30, it's a Prop 98 that will trigger the money going over. When the money for this goes into there, doesn't that reset the floor? So in 7 years, when this funding goes away, we still reset how much we have to be spending?
Yeah, a lot of people, the Prop 98 guarantee, a lot of people will use the analogy of a ratchet, meaning that the spending can go up. In some cases, it actually can go down, but generally, it's resetting the base with a higher expectation of spending. If the revenue were to go away, and again, under both of these, at some point the money disappears, right? These are temporary tax increases. At some point they trigger off, we have less revenue. We still have spending obligations. And that creates a situation where we are today, right? Where we have a gap between our spending obligations and the actual revenue we have. This is the budget gap we've been talking about. So I think that's a concern that's been raised, that with temporary tax increases, you increase the base, but you don't have a long-term permanent way to fund that base. Any other questions? I guess we'll move on to Prop 31, which I think is mine also. We kind of drew straws, and I ended up with these. Well, if you like that, you'll love this. Prop 31 is it's a budget reform measure, I think, is the way the proponents would characterize it. And from this, what we just talked about, I think you should, kind of have a flavor for this. There's a lot of weird, complicated things about the state budget. There's Proposition 98, there's trigger cuts in the budget, there's volatility of revenue sources. We got a lot of weird things going on. Prop 31 would make a number of changes to the way we budget. And in essence, right now, there is a requirement that the budget be balanced. In the Constitution, it's required that when the state passes a budget, it must be balanced. And what that means is that our estimate of spending has to be at least equal to our estimate, estimate of revenue has to at least equal what we estimate we will spend. And those are just estimates. Those are just projections. They're frequently wrong. Under current law, what has happened is the governor can declare, if you go into the budget and you realize there's a gap, the governor can declare a fiscal emergency. Says, oh my gosh, we don't have enough money. Calls the legislature into session and said, you guys have to either cut spending or increase revenue. The legislature then has 45 days to act, and if it doesn't act, nothing happens. That's the current law, all right? Nothing of substance happens. What this would say is if the governor identifies that we have a gap, that the budget's not working, there's a hole, and he calls the legislature into session and says, you guys got to fix this, and 45 days pass, and the legislature hasn't fixed it, the governor can then cut programmatic spending on his own. He can say, look, we had a $4 billion gap, I'm cutting $4 billion in spending. So that's one reform, that's one change under Prop 31, that gives the governor new power to rebalance the budget in the middle of the year by cutting programs. And there's certain programs that are protected, those that are constitutionally protected, which generally means K-12 schools, but other programs would not. Second thing it does is it shifts from an annual budget cycle. Right now, every year, the legislature passes a budget that runs for 12 months. This would change into a 2-year budget. We would pass the budget every 2 years instead. So what that means is legislative sessions would alternate between the year that they do a budget for 2 years, and then the second year, the job of the legislature would be to review programs. And all programs in the state would have to be reviewed, at least every 5 years, to determine if they're operating efficiently and if they're achieving state goals, if they need to be modified in some way. So that's the second big thing, is kind of changing. I guess the concern has been that the legislature is constantly in budget mode. And this would instead say every other year it wouldn't be, and we could turn to other things. The third thing, and this is probably much lower hanging fruit, and I'll say it real briefly, is this would allow local governments to experiment with alternative ways to carry out state programs. Right now, the state provides money to local governments to carry out programs, whether that's social service programs or child welfare. There's lots of things that the cities do, the local governments do. This would allow the locals to say, you know what, there's a different way we can achieve your goal, Sacramento, but not in the exact way that you've set up the law. So we want to come up with what's called a functionally equivalent way to carry out state programs. And so locals will be permitted to come up with functionally equivalent ways to deliver programs under this Prop 31. Anyway, that's essentially it. The one thing that the ballot pamphlet emphasizes in all these measures is how much it's going to cost. And the office that I used to work for is the one that comes up with those estimates, and we frequently say it's very, very difficult to tell. This is one where it's really difficult to tell what the cost would be. The one thing that we know is that under this provision, up to $200 million could shift from the state to locals to carry out these to develop these new programs. That's no net change to state spending. It's just taking $200 million the state currently has, letting locals use it. But beyond that, really difficult to tell what ultimately would happen. Would the state budgets be higher or lower if we did it on a 2-year basis? Would they be more accurate in predicting revenues? Watch this space for further announcements. So that's Prop 31. A question back here.
Regarding the governor's authorization to cut budgets and fiscal emergencies, is that the only thing the governor would do, or would the governor authorize tax increases as well as only cuts?
Yeah, the governor does not have the power to unilaterally increase revenue. Now, that's something I think the governor could ask the legislature to do. Frequently, identify a budget problem, the governor could say, I want the legislature to fix half of this by raising revenue and half of it by doing cuts. And if the legislature balked, the only tool he'd have in his toolbox is making cuts. Other questions? Yeah.
Is anyone else doing two-year budgets? Like,
There's a number of states, and Nevada, according to our visiting scholar, you know, and Nevada's, with all due respect, it's a much smaller budget, it's a much smaller population. So I think the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the advantages of going to your budget? Again, you reduce the amount of effort. The question is, given some of the difficulty we're having in accurately predicting on a one-year basis, how much better can we do on a two-year basis? That's probably editorializing, so I think we'll move on to Prop 32. Thank you.
Talking about Proposition 32 and then also Proposition 33. Proposition 32 is one of the other propositions you've been hearing a lot about. 30, 38, and 32 has a bunch of money behind it. Essentially, the language of Proposition 32 is pretty simple. It essentially does three things. It prohibits unions and corporations from doing payroll deductions using payroll deducted money for political purposes. Right now, unions, if they want to collect money for the unions for the purposes of making campaign contributions or doing independent expenditures, they do it through payroll deduction of the union members. This prohibits either unions or corporations from using payroll deducted money for the purposes of, for any political purpose. It also it outlaws corporations and unions from giving campaign contributions to the committees of candidates who are running for public office. Okay? Now, it also prohibits government contractors from contributing to elected officials as well. Now, those who are in favor of this, which tend to be businesses, general chambers of commerce are in support of this, and then also some taxpayer groups as well. What they argue is that there's too close of a link between special interests and elected officials. And if you can keep the major players in the process, and that would be unions and businesses, from giving money to people who are running for office, then the odds are the linkage between the money that's given and the behavior that comes out of the political process will be severed. Okay? And so they argue this is one way to go about doing that. This applies, they argue, to both unions and corporations. And in addition, it makes all contributions voluntary. Their argument is that anytime you do payroll deductions of campaign contributions, that in fact that's not voluntary by the employee. Those who are against it, and this is pretty much every private and public union in California, is against Proposition 32 for a variety of reasons. One is that all unions collect campaign contributions through payroll deduction. 99% of businesses do not. Okay? So when they say there's an exemption, there's no exemption in the language. It's just that this is how unions collect their money, and for the most part, businesses use profits, not payroll deductions of employees. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. The other thing is, this doesn't apply to all businesses, but just corporations. And a large percentage of corporations, or a large percentage of businesses, are in fact not corporations. So these things apply to all unions, and 90% of what it is unions do, it applies to a smaller percentage of businesses, only those that are registered as corporations, and it applies to maybe 1% of their actual political activity. Okay, so this is why unions tend to be against it, and why businesses tend to be for this particular proposition. Do we have the campaign financing as well? Tons of money being spent. I actually looked up some new numbers this weekend as well. Right now, the spending by those in support is up to $25 million has been spent by those in support, and $55 million by those in opposition. And once again, oppositions, pretty much all unions. Those in support tend to be businesses and trade associations. Okay. Are there any questions about Proposition 32? Yes?
Aren't there other big money people that want to shut it down that aren't labeled a corporation but are still just as bad as the people who are trying to buy the
I guess I don't understand the question. Trying to shut what down?
Trying to shut this down? Trying to shut that down. Is it just unions that make up that 55 million, or is it like Wall Street and all the other horrible people that buy votes?
No, it's actually Wall Street. Many of those Wall Street firms are in fact not corporations. So they will not be affected by this.
So they still get to give money.
So they can still give their money, and they can still, well, if they did payroll deductions, they could do that, but they generally don't. So it's almost, I mean, it is almost entirely unions. To be perfectly honest, I went through and I looked at all the contributors. I didn't see any exceptions, to be perfectly honest. I'm sure there must be some exceptions, but it's like 99% union money.
So it's only going to prevent the unions from doing it and not everyone else who does it.
And for anyone who's registered as a corporation, if they do payroll deductions to collect money for political purposes. And it still keeps corporations from contributing to candidates. They won't be able to do that either. But once again, if you're not registered as a corporation, it doesn't impact you. Did that clarify? Anybody, any other questions? Okay. Proposition 33 is interesting. This is one that's going to affect all of us, but it's not something that you're hearing a lot about so far. To be perfectly honest, I'm kind of surprised by that. Essentially, California regulates auto insurance. And in order to keep rates down, one of the things they do is they regulate how much auto insurance providers or insurance companies can charge people for auto insurance, because they require that we all have it, so they want to make sure that costs are somewhat contained. And there are very limited reasons why an insurance company might increase rates on one person but not increase rates on somebody else. Okay? The idea being they don't want insurance companies to be able to discriminate against certain subgroups of individuals. So very limited reasons why an insurance company can increase a rate. So this is a new piece of legislation. This is a new law that essentially what it does is it's simple if you look at the language. And the language says that it will allow insurance companies to offer a discount to people who have had continuous coverage to attract them to their insurance company. Currently, the only insurance companies that can offer you a discount for continuous insurance coverage is your own insurance company. But if you shift from one insurance company to another, you can't get that continuous coverage discount. Now, those who are in support of this particular initiative basically argue that this is going to create more competition between insurance companies, because now insurance companies are going to be able to compete for each other's business by offering additional discounts, and that this will in fact lower insurance rates and insure more people in the long run. Those who are against this argue that in fact what this actually does is it kind of generates a loophole. Right now there are a limited number of ways that insurance companies can discriminate based on driving record or whatever. And so what this actually does is that it allows companies to offer you a continuous coverage discount, but what then it does sort of by definition is it also means they can then raise your rates for not having continuous coverage. So let's say you go to college and you no longer need a car because you're just taking the bus, and so you have no insurance for 18 months. You go back to get insurance, they can jack up your rates. Does that make sense? So those are the arguments for and against. One, the insurance companies argue that this is actually going to create more competition and lower insurance rates, and those who are against it argue that in fact what this will do will actually increase insurance rates for the most part, because it opens up this opportunity to increase rates that didn't exist previously. Now, what's interesting is the campaign contributions on this particular initiative. Once again, I looked at some new numbers as well. Currently, there's about $8.5 million that's been spent in support of this proposition, of which 99% has come from a man by the name of George Joseph, who is the founder of Mercury Insurance. He's been wanting to try to get into the California market more, his insurance company. So 8.5 million, 99% of that has come from George Joseph. And then 1.4 million has been spent against, and this is generally by consumer watchdog groups who are arguing that this is just a way to get a loophole to be able to increase rates. Any questions about property? Yes?
So you said the insurance companies, for the most part, are saying this is going to cause and create more competition, so we're not for it. Yeah.
No, they're saying they're for it because they say it will create more competition. The idea, the insurance companies would argue that right now they really can't compete for each other's business because there are certain discounts they can only give to their current customers, but they can't offer to new customers to attract new customers. So the insurance companies are in support of this because it allows them to try and attract additional customers. And they argue by doing so, it's going to lower rates, it's going to insure more people, and because it's going to create competition that doesn't currently exist. So the insurance companies in general, but particularly Mercury Insurance, is in support of the legislation, or in support of the law. Yes?
I understand that Nevada has a situation whereby if your insurance lapses, you don't have a car for a year, and 2 lapses, then you lose your discount for continuous insurance. And I think it said that insurance on the average in Nevada is like 80% more.
I actually live in California, so I don't pay for insurance in Nevada, but I do remember when I was thinking about moving to Nevada, I was looking at auto insurance and registration. It was extremely expensive. I mean, in Reno compared to Sacramento. There have been some studies that have shown that where this particular type of discount exists, insurance rates are generally about 50% higher than they are in California. There have been studies that have shown that in states where this particular type of discount is offered, insurance rates are about 50% higher than they are here. Now, that's not to say that this would be the only reason why they're so much higher. Okay, I'm sure it has a lot to do with other regulations in California as well. But the argument is that California has limited regulation for a reason, and that anytime you create a loophole, it gives them more of an opportunity to increase rates. Any other questions? Did I take too much time, Kim? Sorry. I thought I was a good guy.
Before jumping to Prop 34, I just wanted to, I noticed there's one thing I left off of the Prop 31 discussion. Again, Prop 31, that grab bag of budget reforms, the 2-year budget, and allowing the governor to make reductions. The other thing it does is it requires that the legislature, whenever it passes a bill that's going to increase costs or reduce revenue, say through a tax reduction, that the legislature must identify where the money will come from. So let me say that again. If the legislature can pass a bill that has that reduces state revenue or increases state costs, either way, of more than a threshold, which is $25 million, then in order for the legislature to be able to pass that legislation, it must identify where the money is going to come from. Either you're going to take money from some other existing program, or you've got some new revenue source or something. Anyway, I thought I'd just add that to the Prop 31 discussion. Prop 34 is the death penalty, or the lack thereof. The easy way to think about this, it's a repeal of the death penalty. California's had the death penalty since 1978, and since that time, about 900 individuals have been sentenced to death in California. Of those, actually here's my professor mode, of those 900 people who have been sentenced to death since 1978, how many have been executed? 14. 14 have been executed. 83 just died of natural causes at this point, and 75 had their sentences reduced. But this leaves about 725 individuals on death row in California. It's a very slow process, as should be obvious. There are automatic appeals that are generated whenever you've been sentenced to death. And so this initiative comes forward and says, all those people currently on death row, the 725, will have their sentences reduced to life in prison without possibility of parole. So that's step one. All the death row inmates are no longer in death row. They're in prison for life. Number two, there is no new death penalty. There are no capital crimes left in the state. And I imagine most of the capital crimes would be changed to life without parole. And then number 3 is it would provide $100 million over a period of 3 years. I'm sorry, over a period of 4 years. $100 million to provide grants to local law enforcement agencies to increase their efforts to solve homicide and rape cases. So again, this is one of those things where clearly the driver of this is let's get rid of the death penalty. But you have this other piece, which I think is, you know, the tough on crime part, to say we're going to commit additional $100 million in resources towards helping local governments solve homicide and rape cases. So this is one of those issues, again, where under the Constitution, the Legislative Analyst's Office needs to calculate the fiscal impact of this law. This is one where it's really a toss-up. It depends on so many different things. You clearly would get a reduction in running capital cases. You know, a capital case will take years, if not decades, to run the way through the courts. And a non-capital case generally gets resolved more quickly. So you might get some savings in just court costs. In addition to that, the amount of time individuals spend in prison probably wouldn't be that different because, as we've just illustrated, we've only actually executed 14 of these 900 people, so they tend to stick around. So I'm not sure there'd be much change in that. The bigger questions that are really hard to answer are, what would be the effect on the commission of capital crimes, murder primarily? That is there a deterrent effect to having a death penalty? And if you get rid of the death penalty, would you then have less deterrent, therefore more murders? Hard to say. I think that the bottom line for me is I wouldn't try and decide this one on the basis of what's going to happen to the state budget. A, because I don't think it's very easy. It could go either way. I'm not sure there'd be savings or cost. Even with that $100 million, again, there would be $100 million more in spending to local governments. That's just part of the cost. But all the other savings things impossible to determine. This is one of those that I think is much more of a value question or a moral question. You know, should the state be in the business of executions? And I think that's one that, you know, the fiscal issues would only be secondary. So questions about death penalty repeal? Yeah.
So are those, the additional funds, are those strictly just from the savings of all the?
No, this is just saying that of the money that's in the state budget, the state would be required to shell out $100 million. It'd have to come from somewhere. If there were savings from these other things, sure, great, but there's no guarantee. There are many laws, initiatives that have passed that impose costs on the state without identifying a funding source. This is one of them. Yeah.
Is there like a big reason why the state is going to so slow at executing?
Yeah, I can't think of a reason other than this is such a high stakes, obviously, issue. You can't undo an execution. And there have been studies that have identified individuals that have been executed, that have been proven to have been innocent afterwards. So I think people really want to make sure that you've got all the information. The state provides free defense attorneys, you know, for the people fighting these cases. So I think it's just, you know, justice moves slowly in this area. And many other states have death penalties similarly take a long time. Other questions? Yeah.
You might have answered this, I think I was reading when you talked about it. How are we saving money if we're housing everybody for the rest of their life?
I think the response would be we wouldn't be saving money. Well, we're already pretty much housing them for the rest of their lives, so there wouldn't be much change in that part. I think that the savings would come from less court costs, because the state pays a lot of money in conducting these capital court cases. We have our district attorneys, we have the court system itself. We're paying oftentimes for the defense, so those costs would all go away. Yes? Yes, that's a good question. The currently condemned prisoners are housed in single cells without anybody else. They're also, anytime they're being moved, transported, they have to be handcuffed. And prisoners who are not on death row, their life in prison generally are housed 2 to a cell, sometimes even more. So the cost would be reduced there as well. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, I'm going to try and do Proposition 35 really fast, so I apologize for talking so much earlier. Proposition 35 is essentially to increase penalties for human trafficking. It is also requires that any human traffickers register as sex offenders. It requires that all sex offenders report certain types of internet activity to the government once they are identified as sex offenders, and it also relates to asset forfeiture of resources if someone is identified as a human trafficker. Essentially, almost everyone is in support of this particular piece of this initiative. If you look at the money in support, about, let's see here, what are your numbers? They're 2.8 million. There's been no money spent against this.
Pro-human trafficking.
No, but there are groups in opposition, small groups. They tend to be erotic service providers or sex workers. And their argument is that this is just the government's way of trying to get access to their assets. So for example, one woman provides an example that she is a prostitute and if her son lives at her house, then he is benefiting from trafficking, human trafficking, prostitution, and therefore would be considered a sex offender and would have to register as a sex offender. I think it goes too far, and it's just a way of government trying to get access to assets. But as you can see, no one's spending money. It's a relatively small group that is against this particular initiative, and there's a huge number of people in support. So there you go. Questions? Yeah.
Is there any language that addresses assisting or helping the victims to actually traffic?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It does create a program to help victims sort of reintroduce themselves back into society. Yes.
I'm surprised that Church Impact and also Friends Committee Quakers are both opposed to this. Do you have a guess as to why they're opposed?
My general thought would be, gosh, that's a really good question. Probably just like the ACLU general perspective is that maybe that it doesn't have enough protections for people who might be affected by the law. For example, like the example that the woman provided, the sex worker provided about her son, that there aren't enough protections like that. The general argument is that if you benefit in any way from, say, prostitution or any other form of human trafficking, that you then will be registered as a human trafficker. And that maybe there aren't enough protections against people. And also the idea, this also has some, although this would make them support it, it also has some provisions that argue that victims cannot be, so for example, if you're caused through human trafficking to commit a crime, the evidence of that crime cannot be used against you to convict you of that crime if you are in fact a victim of human trafficking. Does that make sense to everybody? So there's that as well. But I don't know if they just don't feel there are enough protections for people for whom the initiative was not supposed to have an impact. You guys have any thoughts on that? Any other questions? I hope I didn't go through that too quickly, but I want to give Kim some time to talk. So.
Okay, Prop 36 is about the three strikes law. So in 1994, we passed by initiative the three strikes law that makes a third offense, if it's a felony, require 25 years to life imprisonment. And this is something that has been discussed pretty much ever since that legislation passed back in 1994, because a felony that can be the third offense can sometimes be for something that's relatively minor, that is a nonviolent offense. And it has meant an increase in the numbers of people in our prison system and the resultant expenditures in the prison system. And so that's what this is meant to address. So the change would mean that the third strike would have to be for a serious or a violent offense, unless one of the first two strikes was rape, murder, or child molestation. So we don't want, the idea is that those people would still be subject to it, but other people who had committed crimes, if the third offense was nonviolent, would not be subject to these same penalties. So it's 25 years to life. As you might imagine, there's a lot of support for this. This is something that has been discussed, like I said, for many years. So the major newspapers, nonprofit organizations. The big exception is the California Republican Party on the endorsements, because they're very much tough on crime and don't want to see a reduction in the potential penalties. And then if you look at the funding, you see that the funding is very lopsided as well. It's very much stronger on the pro than on the con. Yeah, I'm gonna stop with that unless people have questions, because we're running out of time. This one's fairly straightforward. Questions? Okay, and then Prop 37. This one you probably have seen some ads for on Prop 37. It's genetically modified foods. And it requires that a label be attached to any food sold to customers made of plants or animals that have genetically modified portions of their DNA. And it prohibits marketing of any of that GMO food as natural. So you couldn't put natural on the label if the product had some kind of source material that was modified in some way. This is fairly broad, because there's a lot of genetically modified food in our food system, including most corn grown in the United States. So if you think about how many products include corn as a basic staple, for example, it would include an awful lot of products that would be labeled. There are citizen groups and some organizations that are concerned about the possible health consequences to genetically modified foods, though there has not been a study showing that there is definitely a health consequence. The people who argue against this are concerned that there's a lot of bureaucracy that's set up, and the organizations that are growing food and selling food and labeling food would incur a lot of costs to make this happen, to put the labels on all of the food. So you can see that you have many of the newspapers in the state saying no because of the bureaucracy side. That's usually what they're arguing, is that there would be a lot of costs and bureaucracy assigned to it. But there are some organizations that would like to see it happen, and the argument generally is about the freedom of consumers to know what's in their food and to choose whichever food they want based on if it's genetically modified or not. The Democratic Party is in favor of it. The Republican Party is not in favor of it, again, because of the potential costs and because of the additional bureaucracy for it. Yes? If you say yes, you want the labels. If you say no, you don't want the labels. That's a good question. A lot of these initiatives, it's unclear as to which thing is yes and which thing is no. Be careful with that, because you can vote the wrong way by accident. And so the funding on this one, it's, as you would imagine, Monsanto, which is a company that has large holdings in California, they make a lot of the genetically modified seeds, for example. So of course they are very much against this, and that's true with most of these companies. They would be fiscally impacted if this passed. And the pro side tends to be crunchy granola kind of groups. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a better term for it. I shouldn't use that. But you could find these products in the co-op is all I'm saying. So you have a mix of sort of organizations that are pro and con. Questions on that? Yes. Yeah, there are different estimates on how much it would be. It's hard to know exactly. Let's see. they're saying about $1 million for the regulation, but that doesn't count the amount of money that it would cost the actual companies to put the labels. So, you know, who knows exactly how much, millions for sure. All right, 38 we already did, 30. Okay, so 39. Okay, 39 is one that I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more in the press about this one, because it's actually got some pretty big consequences, potentially. So essentially what it does is it requires businesses that have do business in multiple states, so multi-state businesses, to pay income taxes in California if they do business in California. This would create a major change in the amount of money coming into state revenues if those businesses had to pay corporate taxes to California as well. About $1 billion per year would come into California from those corporate taxes. The money would be earmarked, half of it would be earmarked for clean energy and energy efficiency programs. Part of that would be educational programs, training for clean energy jobs. Some of that would be earmarked for energy efficiency in public buildings, so universities, schools, public buildings, retrofitting to be more green. So that's what some of that money would go to. Some of the money would also, half of the money would also go to the general fund. So that could be spent for all sorts of state priorities, whatever the state priorities would, that the legislature would choose to spend it on. As a consequence, in the voter guide, it talks about how, you know, some of the money, one of the arguments is that some of the money would go to Prop 98 to K through 12 schools, because it would be going into that general fund for those funds. So you can see the endorsements are more mixed than some of the initiatives that we're looking at. The Democratic Party not taking a position on this, which is really rare. The Republican Party against it. And then you have very lopsided spending on this one, so much so that it doesn't even, there's no bar over here, because it's so lopsided. But you have certainly citizen organizations on the pro side that are wanting to, as far as they see it, close a tax loophole that would create more corporate taxes. Now, of course, there's a business argument that would say increase in corporate taxes would, you know, create difficulties for those businesses, and they might lose some profits and maybe modify their behavior and do less business in the state, or possibly not be able to hire as many people. All those sorts of arguments come into play with basically what would be an increase in taxes for those corporations that are operating in California. Questions? Yeah. Well, that's certainly the economic argument that's made from the business side, that you know, additional taxes are always detrimental and that it could push some businesses out of the state. It's unlikely, though. You know, these are multi-state businesses, and we're a huge state, so it's unlikely that they would cease to do business in California and continue to do business elsewhere. They may have to reduce the number of employees, though. If you know, if they did choose to do that, that would have those consequences. Yeah.
Since my understanding is the option is that they're currently taxed on the basis either of sales or of how many employees and how much property they have here, which is headquarters. So
right.
If a company's headquarters is here and their headquarters employees are here, it would seem to be they'd be penalized if they would decide then to move out of state. If using this option, they would profit. I mean, they would have a lower tax. So
Yeah, so there may be some business incentive to leave. Yeah, or move their headquarters, at least. They would still probably do business here. Yeah. Okay. Oh, one more.
Do we know who Thomas Dyer is?
That's one thing I meant to look up before I came today. Anyone? No? Someone with a lot of money, or at least formerly with a lot of money. Sorry, I didn't look that one up.
Okay, this last one is kind of an interesting one, because it has a potential impact, even though there's nobody currently suggesting that you vote no. Basically what happened is California's district lines are now being drawn by a citizen redistricting commission, nonpartisan, and not related to the legislature. And so they drew the district lines for this election for 2012. The Republican Party felt as though the Senate district lines were drawn unfairly and were biased towards the Democrats. And so they created this referendum. So this is a referendum on whether we should accept the district lines as drawn by the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Now, this has become a moot point sort of officially because the Supreme Court came down and said you have to use those district lines for 2012. The problem is that if this doesn't pass at the referendum, if you don't say yes, we want to accept the district lines, then it's going to cost the state $1 million to redraw the district lines, even though nobody now wants us to do that. Does that make sense? Because the Supreme Court made it a moot issue, the Republican Party has withdrawn their position, and but we still have to vote because it's on the ballot. So basically, everyone wants you to vote to support the new Senate district lines so that the state doesn't have to spend $1 million it really doesn't have to redraw the district lines that no one now wants to have redrawn. Okay? So this is a weird one because it's a referendum. So and I was so terrified I was going to get this wrong. So you want to vote yes to keep the current district lines. You don't want to vote no so that you will redraw the district lines. Does that make sense to everybody? So I am specifically going to say everyone wants you to vote yes on this one. So don't mess it up and make sure you do the right thing. Any questions on Proposition 40? It was kind of an odd situation. But it is important that you vote on it because if people choose not to vote and if people are confused, they tend to vote no. And if everyone votes no or if no wins, then we end up having to redraw the district lines when no one wants to. Okay, so go vote and vote yes.
Okay, so if you want more information on the initiatives, we have under our voter information page at the Project for an Informed Electorate, there's all kinds of resources that go in depth so you can get more information. And I also wanted to put a plug in for additional events we're having for the PIE. There's another one of these events downtown if you have some friends that you want to direct to that. There's one on Wednesday downtown at the Public Library at 6 p.m. And then on Wednesday the 24th at 3 in the Orchard Suite upstairs, we have a political scientist who's going to give us predictions about who's going to win the presidential election using statistical methods that will blow your mind. And then a week after the election, we have an election recap. We'll have experts in foreign policy, in California politics, and domestic policy, who will come and talk about what happened in the 2012 election a week afterwards so we can assess how it all went, what the election results mean for the country, et cetera. And that is on November 13th, which is a Tuesday from 2 to 3 here. So please come to those events and tell your friends. Yes? We're not doing any more debate events. We had 2 already, and sorry, no more pizza money, really is what it is. But thank you so much for showing up. Share your information with your friends and family so that you can be the opinion leader for them on this, because now you know more than a lot of people.